So what I'm going to do today is, this is like a semi-academic, semi-activist, semi-historian, and a anthropologist, or maybe a sociologist speaking. So it's an interdisciplinary talk that I'm going to give, which is, I think, resonant, particularly because elections in India are around the corner. And I draw from my earlier works and some of my contemporary works in this paper. So basically on September 7, 2014, Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, the right-wing Hindu body, widely regarded as the parent organization of Bharatiya Janata Party, the ruling party of India, published cover stories on love jihad in its weekly mouthpieces, Panchjanya in Hindi and Organizer in English. Love jihad was alleged to be an organized conspiracy under which Muslim men were targeting vulnerable Hindu girls and forcefully converting them to Islam by feigning love through trickery and marriage. The publications urged people to raise the slogan, "Love ever, love jihad never." Panchjanya's cover had an illustration of a man wearing a traditional Arab headdress, the kafia, a beard in the shape of heart, and sinister sunglasses in which red hearts were reflected. The magazine asked on the cover, "Love blind or trade? Pyar andha ya dhandha?" 86 years ago, in 1928, a poem was written in Hindi, which was later banned, called Deeds of Some Muslims, Chand Musalmanon Ki Harkatein, which talked of the conniving Muslims and their conspiracies to take away Hindu women. These two moments are divided over a long time span. Yet they are compelling on several accounts, as they are threatening, prescriptive, and anxiety-ridden at the same time. They epitomize constructions of Muslim men as evil and licentious by politicized Hindu nationalism in modern India. Both instances implicitly also frame a vulnerable Hindu woman, call for militant Hindu male prowess, fabricate fears of declining Hindu numbers, reveal imagined threats at religious conversions, formulate a homogeneous Hindu identity over a sharply divided society, and a desire to reinstate familial patriarchies. Above all, they signify taboos on love that defies boundaries. At the same time, they expose anxieties around women's independent individual expressions of love. Reflecting contradictory intersections, they underline how identities and systems intertwine to produce individual and relational experiences. Feminists have emphasized that love jihad has actually been a jihad against love, an emotive, mythical, and violent campaign, a delicious political fantasy, a lethal mobilization strategy, a vicious crusade, and an attempt at political mobilization in the name of hapless women by the Hindu right. Revealing larger continuities, fabricated metaphors of love jihad have uncanny resemblances to abduction campaigns launched by Arya Samaj in the 1920s in North India, particularly Uttar Pradesh. Taking at its cue such manufactured campaigns, I juxtapose disjunctive invocations of hegemonic Hindu masculinities and sexually ferocious Muslim male on the one hand and recalcitrant love on the other. In the process, I probe intersections between sexualities, religious identities, intimate lives, and political articulations. Metaphors of abduction and love jihad also underscore how men on the margins in different locations, blacks, Muslims, Dalits, Jews, homosexuals, colonized, have often been stereotyped with similar vocabularies. Anne Stoler extends Foucauldian perspectives by combining sexualities with social taxonomies of race. She agrees with Foucault that discourses around sexuality were activated as discursive incitements that facilitated the penetration of self-disciplinary regimes in intimate domains of modern life. But she argues that sexuality in colonial contexts was predicated on exclusionary principles and could not survive without a racially erotic counterpoint, without a reference to the libidinal energies of the primitive, the colonized, which became a marker of derogation and desire. Extending this insight, I argue that it was not just the colonizers. The indigenous Hindu elite men too have underwritten an exclusivist grammar of difference in sexual regimes. I further reflect on how the arc of Hindu female love for men outside the community, even while reifying heteronormativity, has meant that such desire is visceral and tactile, though it can only be acknowledged when it is being regulated as transgression, producing moral policing and everyday violence, along what Foucault calls the alliance model of sexuality, where through arrangement of marriages, boundaries of religion and caste are policed. At the same time, rule breaking by women has often aided a transformative politics of intimate religious rights. Let me first discuss invocations of Hindu male prowess. Insightful works underscore constructions of the white man and his various others in colonial discourses with dichotomies of manly British and effeminate colonial subject. And in contemporary India, links have been drawn between Hindu right, masculinity, and violence. The propertied, high caste, heterosexual Hindu male is at the top of social, religious, and caste hierarchies. He is taken as normal, natural, and ideal. In response to British constructions, manhood emerged as a critical occupation among Hindu reformers and nationalists, as some of these advertisements around aphrodisiacs published at that time show. Equally, scholars stress that in a world of competing masculinities, home was the last refuge of colonized males' self-esteem, which relied on discursive management of the woman's body. By early 20th century, along with freedom movement, there also emerged a more public, masculine Hindu nationalism cutting across boundaries of home and civil society. Correspondingly, there was sharpening of religious identities which embraced the social as a site of sameness. UP witnessed Hindu-Muslim riots as never before in the 1920s. Hindu Mahasabha and Arya Samaj attained a new importance, challenging religious conversions through Shuddhi and Sangathan, which constructed a full-bodied male, emphasizing martial aspects of Hinduism. Amidst this, there were popular demagogic appeals by a section of Hindu publicists against abductions of Hindu women by Muslim scoundrels or gundas, ranging from allegations of rape and elopement to luring, conversion, love, and forced marriages. Drawing on newspapers, pamphlets, meetings, handbills, novels, myths, and gossip, the campaign attempted to monopolize the field of everyday representation. In the Love Jihad campaign too, through invocations of female purity, Hindu male prowess attempts to assert itself in intimate and political domains. With its emotive appeal, the issue can potentially carry the fear of Muslim into every Hindu home. These politicized entanglements generate an intimate politics, an embodied struggle, in which threatened familial structures reformulate themselves through women, providing an effective grid to Hindutva politics. What is involved in Love Jihad is an imagined community at war against Muslim terror. This also helps in papering divisions in Hindu society and in establishing an upper caste hegemony. It may also be noted here that the rhetoric of motherland or Bharat Mata is perhaps proving to be insufficient for today's context, and a more aggressive portrayal of fatherland and semen retention identified with masculinized identities is now taking place, which also feeds into fears of illicit intimacies. Appeals were specifically issued to Hindu brothers by an outfit called Anti-Love Jihad Front to protect their Hindu sisters. In this context, constructions of the lustful Muslim male acquire particular significance. Muslims have routinely been constructed as the ultimate other of Western secular modernity, with Islam perceived as a destabilizing threat, particularly in present context of global terrorism. Erotic racism is often rooted in competitive masculinities. Abduction and love jihad campaigns buttress such tropes. The location of the Muslim male is a reciprocal formation of aggressive Hindu politics, setting up an internal dialogue within it. In early 20th century, a number of polemical tracts in the vernacular decreed Islam, Quran, and Muslims. At the heart of many was the spectre of the lustful Muslim male. From 1923, a growing number of supposed cases of abduction of Hindu women were reported in the local newspapers. They collaborated with limitations of human memory to produce a master narrative of Muslim male aggression and Hindu women's seizure. Muslim men were depicted as waylaying Hindu women at wells, hospitals, and neighborhoods. Hate speech is always repeatable speech. Abduction was represented as a general phenomenon whereby different events were made to follow a similar narrative. In repetition lay strength and one of the primary sources of communal power, its ability to perpetually renew itself through reiteration and its authority as common sense. Memories of the past have significance in the present, triggering new memories. In more forceful ways, cliches of licentious Muslims have been renewed with topical contours added through motifs of love jihad. Hindutva spokespersons have stated that love jihad is a characteristic Muslim activity and all young Muslim men are potentially threatening. BJP's UP President Lakshmikant Vajpayee pronounced, "Have they got certificate to rape girls because they belong to a particular religion?" He went on to enunciate that 90% of all rapes were committed by Muslims. The proliferation of such discourses has no correlation with actual incidences. Love jihad is predicated on exclusionary principles. There is often a move from particular cases to abstract statements. Representation, performance, and events feed into each other where the spectre of illegibility is marked as Muslim. In the wake of terrorist threats and Muslim fundamentalism, new dimensions have been created of a global Islamist conspiracy and foreign hand in love jihad. It is professed that Muslim youth are receiving funds from abroad for purchasing designer clothes, vehicles, mobile phones, and expensive gifts to lure Hindu women. Dr. Chandra Mohan, spokesperson of the BJP in UP, stated, "This is part of global love jihad that targets vulnerable Hindu girls. It is alleged that beautiful, well-dressed young Muslim men are posing as Hindus. With red puja threads on their wrists and ambiguous nicknames, they are hanging around girls' schools and colleges. The sexual violation of women gets distorted by the reversal projections of Hindu right. Significantly, the politics of food, non-vegetarianism, and particularly beef eating is interconnected to alleged lust of Muslims. SSK Jain, a trader and RSS supporter from Madhya Pradesh, claims that non-vegetarian food, particularly beef, is responsible for dark thoughts in human mind, which in turn leads to increased antisocial activities by Muslims, including interreligious and intercaste marriages. Muslim men, often living on the margins of dominant imaginations in India, have been negatively raised through a genetic optic. The imagined dangers of Muslim peril flow from perceived transgressions of social spaces by Muslim men. Demographic designing by Hindu right has fed such metaphors. In the imagined demographies of racial purists, blacks, poor, colonized, Muslims, and other tainted identities are perceived as being more fertile and populous than civilized individuals. Population growth in Muslim countries is viewed as threatening to the West. In colonial India, the British used census as an important tool for systematically quantifying ethnic religious classifications. A common thread between abduction campaigns and love jihad is its obsession with numerical strength of Hindus. Concern with an alleged decrease in Hindu numbers and a corresponding increase in Muslims grew rapidly following the All India census in 1871. Supposed decreases in Hindu population were lamented, saying that from 330 million, their numbers had now been reduced to a mere 200 million. Selectively using statistics from 1911 and 1921 census, it was said that since last 10 years, Hindus had been reduced by 0.8 million, while Muslims had increased by 2.1 million. If this continued, after some years, no Hindu would be found in India. Newspapers, magazines, and even caste journals propounded similar myths with catchy titles like The Terrible Decline of Hindus, Hinduon ka bhayankar haas. Of the various reasons given by Hindu publicists for the alleged decline of Hindus and simultaneous proliferation of Muslims, an important one was increasing frequency of abductions, conversions, love and marriages between Muslim men and Hindu women. In the 1920s, various publications mourned the potential loss of childbearing Hindu wombs to Islam. The supposedly superior often blamed the supposedly inferior for their genetic shortcomings. Praveen Tagodia, leader of Vishwa Hindu Parishad, a militant Hindu organization, blamed growing impotency among Hindu men for the decline in India's population and exhorted them to worship their manhood. Numbers game is central to Hindutva politics. Religious conversions have been regarded as altering demographic equations. RSS describes love jihad as a movement to convert vulnerable Hindu girls to Islam, to decrease Hindu population, and as an international conspiracy to increase Muslim numbers. The Hindu right harps on a weird arithmetical equation, making it part of everyday common sense. In this lament, twin devices of anti-conversion and reconversion are seen to increase Hindu numbers. Various statistical surveys have debunked theories of declining Hindu numbers. What is significant, however, is that through such arguments, even a demographic and dominant majority can portray itself as an endangered minority. Let me move now to imaging of the victimized Hindu woman in such campaigns. Women's bodies are often geographies on which hetero-militarist masculinities capture territory. Abduction and love jihad motives, while focusing their anger on Muslims, acquire their emotional bonding through imaging victimized Hindu women. Scholars have explored changing configurations of power in histories of victimhood, where images of hapless victim stand in contrast to the brutal perpetrator. The organization of Hindutva has been inseparable from the imperative of affirming love taboos, disciplining sexual desire, and to hold in place complex hierarchies which are generated by social rules of difference. For politicized Hinduism, one's religious identity is a protean category, and managing the domestic is crucial to it. The troubled intimacies of domestic spaces have coalesced around gender and family in Hindutva vocabularies. Who is bedding and wedding Hindu women is embedded in distinct Hindu nationalism. Muscular nationalism rests on a gendered binary of martial man versus chaste woman. The converted Hindu woman is metamorphosed into a symbol of sacredness and humiliation. Campaigns like Love Jihad privilege moral panic and familial controls over constitutional ethics. In early 20th century UP, tracts appeared written exclusively around vulnerable Hindu female victim and Muslim male abductor. They had provocative titles like Loot of Hindu Women, Hindu Auraton ki Loot, and Causes of Plunder of Hindu Women, Hindu Striyon ki Loot ke Karan. Hindu society was urged to accept the victimized woman. In such articulations, one can discern a ghostly, shadowy presence of social reforms with an element of humanitarian concern for the condition of women. Yet, through such portrayals, the center of sexual violence moved from men in general and Hindu men in particular towards the Muslim male. In the present moment of love jihad, there is no semblance of reformist energy. The politics of cultural virginity is shadowed by a myth of innocence combined with selective rants against invasion, conversion, and seduction. The Hindu woman has often been regarded as an exclusive preserve of Hindu men, and safeguarding her virtue is identified as his exclusive prerogative. In the name of protecting our women, which they have never asked for, all violence against Muslim men and disobedient Hindu women is justified. The language of safety and protection has also been selectively taken from increasing cases of rape, particularly the Nirbhaya case in Delhi. Love jihad allows one to portray the Muslim as a far worse rapist, shifting registers of violence. RSS General Secretary Suresh Bhaiyaji Joshi stated in a press conference that Hindu Samaj has been facing the shame of love jihad since long, and UP government should take a serious view of it as it hurts the dignity of women. Even before the term love jihad was coined, Hindu organizations like Bajrang Dal and Ram Sena ran Save the Honor of Daughter-in-Laws and Daughters, Bahu Betiyon Ki Izzat Bachao campaign, and a movement to save daughters, Beti Bachao Andolan, whose central focus was to enforce love taboos by keeping Hindu girls away from Muslim men. On a side note, love jihad has sometimes also been called Romeo jihad. In this context, the launch of anti-Romeo squads by the BJP government in UP, while supposedly meant to be against the euphemism of eve-teasing, have actually become a source of harassment and fear for women and men and a means to perpetuate love taboos. Prashant Bhushan, a lawyer, not perhaps in good taste, but in tongue-in-cheek manner, said on a tweet, "Romeo loved just one lady, while Krishna was a legendary Eve teaser." Would UP Chief Minister Yogi Adityanath have the guts to call his vigilantes anti-Krishna squads? Wrote another, alas for Shakespeare, Yogi Adityanath's anti-Romeo squad in UP has conjured Romeo up to be a feckless hoodlum, a creature who has exponentially gained an identity of carnal calling and is now a viral disease infecting a pure and sacred state. Feminists have reiterated that there is a sharp distinction between consensual friendship, flirtation, and love between adults, irrespective of class, caste, or religion, in which nobody has the right to interfere, and between sexual harassment and stalking of women. Pramod Mutallik, the leader of Ram Sena, was instrumental in coining the term love jihad and claims it first featured in Hindutva groups around 2005 when there was a spike in terrorist activities across the country. The term is also interesting as both love and jihad are perceived as foreign terms, alien to the Indian soil. Love thus sits more comfortably here, perhaps than say ishq or praying. And in 2014, relying on stereotypes that Muslim women are slaves of husbands, various posters appealed to Hindu men to protect their daughters and sisters from becoming victims of love jihad. Repeated use of words like sachet, savdhan, and jagruk, which are synonymous for being beware and careful, invoke the need to watch over oneself and over women. Separate cases have also been constructed as a coherent morality drama whereby every interfaith romance and marriage has been rewritten as deception. Love Jihad campaign represents the woman as foolish, lured and brainwashed into the trap with no mind or heart of her own. Armed with peacock feathers and blessed water, a god-man, Baba Rajat Das, advocates love taboos by selling a love cure in parts of North India to save Hindu girls, who according to him get easily carried away by Muslim boys as they do not understand that they are being exploited. He claims to have expertise in this field and to have cured many girls of this disease. The courts too often take on the mantle of paternal patriarchs. In the recent case of Hadia Akhila, the homeopathy student who embraced Islam and thereafter married a Muslim man, the court initially grossly infantilized Hadia. Eroding her agency and silencing her voice, the court ordered an annulment of the marriage. Her vociferous denial of charges of force was dismissed with assertions about her mediocre intelligence, young age, and incapacity to think independently. A woman's turn to Islam, it appears, can only be interpreted in the legal matrix of terrorism. Equally, the Muslim male is denied the language of love. In a horrifying incident, BJP Mahila Morcha's Aligarh leader, Sangeeta Varshney, was caught on camera slapping a woman for being in a relationship with a Muslim man. Varshney yells at the woman in the video after slapping her twice. "Don't you have any shame? Do you think you are that grown up? Can you not even understand who is a Hindu and who Muslim?" Ironically, an FIR was filed in the case, not against Varshney, but the man. In convoluted ways, women are told that interreligious romance is undesirable for good of women themselves. There appears a consensus among Hindu groups against any exercise of choice by women to love or convert as individuals, sans familial and community approval. In 2015, Himalaya Dhwani, a magazine of Durga Vahini, the women's wing of Vishwa Hindu Parishad, had on its cover the image of a leading actress of Bollywood, Kareena Kapoor, who has married a Muslim actor, half covered in the burqa, arguing that this was the dreadful fate of Hindu women who married Muslim men. Through such constructions, as Wendy Brown argues, certain facts are selected and highlighted, while other crucial information is omitted. Moralism is subtly and almost imperceptibly secreted into the narrative, fear is induced and mobilized, metonymic claims of victimization are established, demonization of the enemy is artfully staged. Hindu women's everyday lives have been bombarded with instructions imposing not only love taboos but multiple restrictions. All-out attempts have been made by Hindu pamphleteers to keep Hindu women away from Muslim men and from symbols, customs, and culture perceived as Muslims. Not only intimate liaison, even day-to-day contact with Muslims is perceived as a threat to Hindu community identity, leading to a new set of instructions for Hindu women. It has been emphasized that since races, religions, and castes share the most extended and close contact, routine, cumulative, mundane, at workplace, love and desire arise most frequently, if almost counterintuitively, in the context of work relations. Expressing anxieties around such shared spaces in the 1920s, every Hindu Sabha was asked to keep a list of jobs which brought Muslims in contact with Hindu women. A whole new language was employed for women vis-a-vis Muslims, telling them how to move, whom to talk to, where to go, and what to do. All places of possible contact between Hindu women and Muslim men, private and public, came under this ambit. So the bangle seller, for example, is being demonized, and the Hindu woman is being told to be away from him. This was publicized through Women's Education, or Stri Shiksha, written by a prominent Arya Samaj member of UP. Detailed and minute instructions, as this list of instructions shows, affirm the agenda of community distinctiveness by means of social and economic separation. The image of the Muslim became more menacing, far more dangerous than even that of the British. The metaphor of love jihad too attempts to penetrate everyday lives of women. Hindutva cry for segregation expresses a geography that maps power and hierarchy through women's bodies. In various meetings held in UP, instructions have been given to Hindu women, including not to wear green clothes and not to go to Muslim tailors and barbers. Everyday public spaces like schools, colleges, theatres, ice cream and juice parlors, mobile charge shops, and private spaces like television and internet are identified as sites where Hindu girls are wooed. Pramod Mutallik has written a book, Love Jihad, Red Alert for Hindu Girls, which gives instructions on how to impose love taboos on Hindu women and how to forestall them from becoming victims. It has instructions like, be cautious about her wearing a headscarf, since it becomes difficult to recognize a girl who wears a headscarf and sits behind a two-wheeler. Since some cases of love jihad have taken place with help of mobile phones, check incoming calls. So these are instructions for parents. Remember that saved numbers may be under a false name. To get help from Hindus in a difficult situation, apply kumkum on the forehead. Muslim men have been banned from dance celebrations as well in Gujarat, in parts of Maharashtra. Such minute instructions reveal the need felt not so much to protect the Hindu woman, but to facilitate penetration of disciplinary regimes and love taboos. The language of protection actually means that women have to be kept on watch on a daily basis. All private public spaces then need to be patrolled, and if so-called love jihadists take on Hindu names to fool women, then all love affairs are presumptively suspect, since an apparently Hindu boy may actually be a love-taughting jihadist, which in turn means that the only way that love jihad can be thwarted is by launching a jihad against love, thus imagining that all interfaith marriages are also love jihad. There functions a grim coercive power behind avowals of protection. These are attempts at codification through instructions as they mandate a set of behaviors on the part of Hindu women, insulate their social spaces, and signify assiduous control over their movements. A Hindu-coded nation is deciding the rules of love, intimacy, and desire. Such desires remain radically unthinkable and lead to various constraints, including, as Butler says, the radical unthinkability of desiring otherwise, the radical unendurability of desiring otherwise, the absence of certain desires, the repetitive compulsion of others, and the abiding repudiation of some sexual possibilities. Instructions to women attempt to erase female subjectivity and desire. Such a woman is an enemy within, a menace for Hindutva. The intermeshing of romance, marriage, and conversion produces choreography of everyday violence framed around women's bodies. These women are actually not vulnerable victims, but risk-taking subjects. The last part of my presentation thus moves to recalcitrant desires that defy all love taboos. The meaning of desire is context-based, yet desire can be a source of creativity, producing new optimism and new narratives of possibility. Historian Michel Birnbaum remarks that desire can be an interracial and interpersonal dynamic, a kind of synapse on the color line rather than an individual site of intention, hopes, dreams, wishes. Lauren Berlant argues that desire can measure fields of difference and distance. It both constructs and collapses distinctions between private and public. It reorganizes worlds. Love and desire destabilize the very things they are disciplined to organize and reopen the utopian to more promises, providing a language of intimacy and rights. Located in politics and the everyday, intimacy is constantly in a flux, and I talked about this in the morning as well, contestable and rewritable, disrupting presumably seamless boundaries. Anthony Giddens observes that the possibility of intimacy means the promise of democracy. Intimacy provides us with new ways to talk of ideas made material through the physical body. Interreligious romances and intimacies destabilize the seemingly unambiguous agenda of a triumphant Hindu majoritarianism. Metaphors of abduction and love jihad also epitomize fears of Hindutva politics regarding female free will, subversive potential of love, non-normative embodiments, pliable religious identities, and syncretic practices. Reclaiming messier practices of sexual desire that constantly transgress prescriptions from within are important sites of resistance. The desires of Hindu women often do not conform to dominant ideas in the public life of a Hindu nation. Many women have negotiated intimacies beyond its moral and social parameters, reflecting shifting registers of unspoken ambivalences. I wish to end my presentation with 3 examples that underscore transcendent possibilities of defiant love and desires. First, Richard Eaton's work on religious conversions underlines that they do not signify a passive acceptance of a monolithic outside essence. Conversion to Islam and Christianity in India has entailed creative and selective adaptation and constant translation, whereby religions have been vernacularized according to people's needs. Conversions by some women in colonial India, especially those on the margins, widows, Dalits, sex workers, hinted at recuperative possibilities of impossible love. Their romantic involvements were possibly aided by greater mobility, as the hustle and bustle of urban life pushed against boundaries of caste and religious separation. Through limited but still subversive ways, their localized and quotidian practices offered new gendered selves. Recently, thus, came a phenomenal statement from a woman: "I'm Saldan, I'm Shifya. I choose to be both. It saddens me that my marriage and spiritual choice are misused to stoke fears and hatred. Nobody asked me my view, as if I don't matter in this game of misogyny played in my name." It is a brazen attempt to suppress and threaten a woman who has shown the courage to follow her heart. Second, moving to a different plane, amidst cries of love jihad in 2014, and the scenario has of course changed now, popular cultural space saw the launch of Zindagi, a channel which is now closed down, an Indian entertainment television channel which began telecasting cross-border serials from Pakistan. The channel captured Indian imagination, and Fawad Khan, a Pakistani Muslim male, became an endearing metaphor, the new heartthrob of Indian girls and women. Fan mails poured over websites. One said, "You have to be living under a rock if you have not heard of Fawad Khan yet. Did your mother not just tell you she has a crush on Fawad Khan? Your female colleagues are probably head over heels in love with him too. Women maybe have more photos of Fawad Khan in their phones than their own." Describing the film Khoobsurat, or Beautiful, in which Fawad Khan starred, Shobha Dey stated, "So, who is this real Khoobsurat in the movie? Any guesses? You've got it. It's a slim, bearded bloke from across the border. He's as yummy as those irresistible Lahori kebabs, and desi ladies want him." Juxtaposing disjunctive phenomena of love of Fawad Khan with cries of love jihad is stimulating, as it hints at religious and national liminality that can stump the hysteria of love jihad. It also underlines fear over agency of upwardly mobile middle-class women to desire whom they please. Representations of Fawad Khan and constructions of love jihad in different ways are part of fictive imaginations, spectacles, and obsessions. Yet they undercut each other, personifying allegories of desire on the one hand and embodying fear and hatred on the other. One contests Hindu heteropatriarchal power, the other reinstates it. The metaphor of Fawad discursively bridges the physical and psychological distance between Hindu-Muslim, Indian-Pakistani, signifying a mobility which defies tantrums of Hindutva brigade. And as I said, the scenario has changed actually at the present moment. It also hints that a section of Indians are nonchalant to the delusional constructions of monstrous Muslim male. The contrasts between romantic and pathological, hero and villain, icon and devil, defender and predator bring out the paradoxes of our society. My final example draws from the substantial increase in intercaste, interreligious marriages, particularly in the past few decades, in spite of several adversities and threats. Interviews with interfaith couples persuasively challenge love jihad. These localized and embodied practices require social courage and show how some people, particularly women, have taken control of their lives. Such women and men implicitly place themselves between two worlds, deftly dealing with both. It is their ephemeral existence and their instability as fixed religious and national beings which is a source of hope. As Nivedita Menon says, young men and women are falling in love across caste and religious divides. And this is rocking the foundations of caste and religious identity. Even in these terrible times, every single day, another young woman decides to risk her very life on the strength of a glance. Another young man defies death for a smile. Subversive youthful desire. It's enough to cheer up the most jaded of middle-aged anti-romantics. Janki Nair says, Indian women have taken control of their lives at a much faster pace than expected and are no longer passive bearers of caste, religious, ethnic, or other meaning, but the makers of meaning. Ambedkar, the great anti-caste ideologue, upheld intercaste marriages as one way to annihilate caste, since it produced fissures in maintenance of caste purity and control of women's sexuality. It is important to raise caution about such ebullient aspirations, as societal change in terms of caste and religion is too heavy a burden to place on the shoulders of intercaste interfaith couples. Yet implicitly, they do produce cracks in orthodox Hindu mandates and on love taboos. Such an exercise of choice, even when partial, can perhaps aid a transformative politics of intimate religious rights. The recalcitrance of love and interreligious marriage can throw up emancipatory possibilities of rights where highly ritualized acts of conversion and marriage could at times become a metaphor for a new vocabulary of body, of interiority, of subjectivity. To conclude, metaphors of abduction and love jihad, separated by almost a century, point to certain ideological continuities between past and present. However, constructions of the dreadful, the appalling, and the phobic are being constantly undercut by matrices of desire, eroticism, and intimacy. The idea of a monocultural, hegemonic Hindu nation often functions as a fabrication. The precariousness of Hindutva designations in asserting the primacy of Hindu men and the mastery of Hindu masculinity are under threat from within. A politics that imposes love taboos and designates which partners are appropriate and legitimate is no longer tenable. The dynamics of heterogeneities are knocking on our doors, violating the mandates of both segregation and patriarchy, whereby processes of exclusion and by implication inclusion have developed fissures. The links between sex and segregation, between control of women and Hindu supremacy are being subverted as religious divisions have become muddier and more fluid. Certain aspects of popular culture, our everyday practices and love, dismantle the wild allegations of abduction and love jihad. Such markers and spaces need to be taken seriously for what they tell us about our society. Hybrid and syncretic religious cultural practices, our love for Fawad Khan, the openness of a section of people to interreligious romances symbolize religious crossings, transgressions of love taboos, and flirtations with moral castigations, imperiling the Hindutva order. Thank you.